On the final days of 2006, a quiet transfer left the British Treasury for Washington. $83 million, one last payment on a loan signed 6 decades earlier. With that transaction, Britain finished settling the financial legacy of a war it had officially won in 1945. The victory had been celebrated for generations. The bill, however, lasted far longer. What is rarely explained is what that debt actually represented. It was not repayment for triumph, nor a routine post-war obligation. It was the cost imposed for staying alive long enough to reach victory at all. While the fighting raged, survival came with terms, and those terms extended well beyond weapons and supplies. Interest payments tell only part of the story. The larger transfer occurred earlier, quietly, while the outcome of the war was still uncertain. Between 1940 and 1945, as Britain fought for its existence, an immense flow of wealth crossed the Atlantic, not through conquest or occupation, but through contracts, conditions, and necessity. By the time peace arrived, the battlefield had been won. The balance sheet had already been settled. To understand how such an acquisition became possible, one must begin with the position Britain occupied before the war began. In 1939, the British Empire was not a declining power living on borrowed prestige. It was the central pillar of the global financial system. Nearly a quarter of the world's land surface lay under British control, bound together not only by force, but by commerce, currency, and capital. The pound sterling functioned as the world's reserve currency. British banks financed trade across continents. British investors owned railways in South America, plantations in Asia, oil fields in the Middle East, and industrial assets across the globe. London, not New York, was the clearinghouse of international finance. Britain entered the war as the world's largest creditor nation, holding vast gold reserves and a century's worth of accumulated overseas wealth. That position did not collapse slowly. It evaporated. Within 7 months of fighting Nazi Germany, Britain had exhausted its liquid resources. War production consumed capital at a pace no imperial balance sheet had ever been designed to withstand. Export industries were shuttered. Shipping lanes were under attack. Dollar earnings disappeared, even as dependence on American steel, oil, aircraft, and ammunition became absolute. The paradox was brutal. Britain still possessed an empire, but it no longer possessed cash. Survival now depended on access to American industry, yet access came with terms. From this moment forward, Britain's strategic decisions would no longer be determined by battlefield necessity alone, but by the conditions imposed by the only nation capable of keeping it supplied. That dependency was formalized through a policy that appeared neutral in law but devastating in effect. When war broke out in Europe, the United States declared itself a non-belligerent, bound by domestic isolationism and the Neutrality Acts passed by Congress. On paper, these laws treated all warring nations equally. In practice, they created a financial choke point that only Britain was forced to pass through. The so-called cash and carry provision allowed belligerents to purchase American weapons and supplies, but only if they paid in cash, transported the goods themselves, and received no credit of any kind. There would be no loans, no deferred payment, no wartime accommodation. Gold or dollars were required before anything left the dock. For Britain, this was not a choice but an obligation. American industry was the only source capable of meeting its military needs at scale. British factories could not replace aircraft losses, steel consumption, and fuel demand fast enough, while German submarines made domestic production ever more fragile. To keep fighting, Britain paid. It paid first in dollars, then in gold, then in securities. As reserves dwindled, the Treasury authorized the transfer of its remaining financial assets across the Atlantic. Convoys carried bullion, bonds, and overseas investments to vaults in North America, not as strategy, but as payment. By late 1940, Britain had shipped out the accumulated wealth of generations. What remained of the empire still existed on maps, but its liquid foundation had been drained. This was not the cost of defeat. It was the price of continued participation, exacted before a single promise of assistance was made. With Britain's liquid reserves drained by cash and carry, what followed has long been remembered as an act of rescue. Lend-Lease entered public memory as proof of American generosity, framed as the moment an ally stepped forward to keep Britain alive. Yet the assistance did not arrive to prevent financial collapse. It arrived only after collapse had been made unavoidable. Before aid could begin, American officials required Britain to demonstrate that it had exhausted every alternative. Possession of assets, whether public or private, was treated not as a foundation for recovery, but as evidence of unfinished obligation. The condition was explicit. Britain was ordered to produce a full inventory of imperial wealth: gold, foreign investments, overseas subsidiaries, and income-generating enterprises owned by British citizens across the world. Only after these holdings were identified could they be dismantled. Assets located in the United States were singled out for immediate sale, regardless of market conditions. British negotiators warned that forced liquidation in wartime would destroy long-term value, converting productive investments into one-time payments at distressed prices. The warning was acknowledged and ignored. Congress required proof that Britain was truly broke, and liquidation was the proof demanded. Companies were sold under compulsion, securities unloaded into unfavorable markets, and decades of accumulated capital were exchanged for short-term survival. The proceeds did not return to Britain for reconstruction or relief. They were absorbed directly into American accounts to settle existing supply contracts. Only after this process was complete did Lend-Lease funds begin to flow. In appearance, the arrangement was assistance. In function, it was a controlled dismantling. Britain was allowed to continue fighting, but only after surrendering the economic base that would have allowed it to stand independently once the war was over. Once Britain's financial assets had been stripped away, the terms of survival moved beyond balance sheets and into geography. Even before Lend-Lease was formally approved, Britain had begun exchanging strategic position for immediate relief. In 1940, with German submarines tightening their grip on Atlantic supply lines, Britain faced a critical shortage of escort vessels. The United States responded with an offer that appeared pragmatic, but carried permanent consequences. 50 aging destroyers, relics of the First World War, long mothballed and of limited combat value, would be transferred to Britain. In return, the United States would receive 99-year leases on British military bases, stretching across the Atlantic and the Caribbean. The exchange was unequal in both duration and value. The destroyers were temporary assets, many barely seaworthy and costly to maintain. The bases, by contrast, were permanent strategic footholds. They granted the United States control over key maritime corridors, air routes, and staging points from Newfoundland to the Caribbean basin. What Britain relinquished was not merely territory, but command of the defensive architecture that had sustained its maritime dominance for generations. Presented publicly as cooperation between allies, the agreement functioned as a transfer of strategic sovereignty under duress. Britain did not trade from strength, it traded from necessity. The choice was not between good and bad terms, but between acceptance and isolation. By signing away access for nearly a century, Britain enabled the construction of an American global basing network that would outlast the war itself. From that moment forward, Atlantic security no longer revolved around London. It was reorganized around Washington. Britain remained a participant in the alliance, but it was no longer the architect of the system it depended on. If the exchange of bases for ships transferred strategic control, the terms embedded within Lend-Lease ensured that economic control would follow. Buried deep within the agreement was Article VII, a clause that appeared technical, even benign, but carried consequences far beyond its language. In return for continued assistance, Britain agreed to eliminate discriminatory practices in international trade after the war. In principle, this meant openness and fairness. In practice, it required the dismantling of imperial preference, the tariff system that bound the British Empire together as a protected economic unit. Imperial preference was not a relic of protectionism. It was the mechanism that sustained Britain's global position. It ensured that goods produced in Britain moved more cheaply through imperial markets than those of foreign competitors. Canada, Australia, India, and other territories bought British products not because they were superior, but because the system made them affordable. Article VII required Britain to abandon this structure and expose its industries to full competition at the very moment they would be weakest. The implications were understood at the time. With factories exhausted by war production and capital depleted by liquidation, British firms were in no position to compete with American companies that had expanded, modernized, and captured global supply chains during the conflict. When imperial barriers fell, American manufacturers entered markets that had once been reserved for British goods. Cars, machinery, consumer products, and industrial equipment flowed into territories that had anchored Britain's commercial empire. The result was not a gradual adjustment, but displacement. Markets that had sustained British industry for generations were lost in a matter of years. The empire still existed politically, but its economic cohesion had been deliberately dismantled. Britain had fought the war to preserve its position, yet the conditions of assistance ensured that the foundation of that position would not survive the peace. The dismantling of Britain's imperial trading system coincided with a deeper asymmetry that unfolded over the course of the war itself. While Britain redirected nearly its entire industrial base toward survival, the United States fought on two fronts, simultaneously, military and commercial. British factories produced aircraft, munitions, and naval equipment at the expense of civilian output. Export industries withered. Long-established markets in Latin America, Asia, and Africa were abandoned as shipping and capital were diverted to the war effort. Britain remained a producer of necessity, but it ceased to be a supplier to the world. The United States, by contrast, expanded without such constraint. Protected by geography and unthreatened at home, American industry scaled at unprecedented speed. It manufactured weapons for itself and its allies while continuing to produce consumer goods for global markets. American automobiles, machinery, radios, and household products flowed into regions Britain could no longer serve. As British firms disappeared from international trade routes, American companies filled the vacuum not by conquest, but by availability. The result was a structural shift that outlasted the fighting. By the war's end, the center of global finance had moved decisively across the Atlantic. Gold reserves accumulated in American vaults, trade settlement increasingly cleared in dollars. London's role as the world's financial hub gave way to New York, not through collapse but through displacement. The pound sterling, once the foundation of global exchange, lost its central function as the dollar assumed that role. In this sense, the United States emerged from the war having secured more than victory. It gained dominance in production, trade, and finance advantages that reinforced one another and reshaped the post-war order long before peace was formally declared. That shift in global balance might have softened in the aftermath of victory. Instead, it hardened. When the war ended, Britain expected a period of transition time to reconvert factories, restore exports, and stabilize its economy after years of total mobilization. What arrived instead was an immediate reckoning. Just 7 days after Japan's surrender, the United States terminated Lend-Lease without warning. Supply contracts were canceled, shipments already at sea were recalled, and the financial lifeline that had sustained Britain through the final years of the war was cut overnight. The timing was devastating. Britain's economy had been reshaped entirely around war production. Civilian industries were idle, foreign earnings non-existent, and food imports covered largely by American financing. With Lend-Lease withdrawn, Britain faced the prospect of hunger and default simultaneously. There were no reserves left to draw upon, no markets quickly accessible, and no alternative source of credit large enough to fill the gap. What had been framed as temporary assistance revealed itself as absolute dependency. Confronted with the risk of economic collapse, Britain had no leverage remaining. The only option was to seek a loan from the same power that had just withdrawn support. Negotiations in Washington made clear that this would not be a grant nor a recognition of sacrifice, but a commercial arrangement. In 1946, Britain accepted the Anglo-American loan, not as a step toward recovery, but as a means of survival. The war had been won. Yet the peace began under conditions more constraining than defeat. The loan that kept Britain from immediate collapse carried a final condition that transformed emergency dependence into permanent financial subordination. As part of the Anglo-American agreement, Britain was required to make the pound sterling freely convertible into U.S. dollars within a fixed timetable. On paper, this was presented as a return to normal monetary order and free trade. In practice, it exposed a weakened currency to forces it was structurally incapable of resisting. During the war, Britain had accumulated large sterling balances across its empire and trading partners, while preventing those balances from being exchanged for dollars. This restriction preserved reserves but left latent pressure embedded throughout the system. Once convertibility was imposed, that pressure was released instantly. Governments, central banks, and commercial institutions moved to exchange pounds for dollars, not out of hostility, but out of rational calculation. American industry dominated global supply, and the dollar had already become the settlement currency of choice. The result was swift and severe. Britain's foreign exchange reserves drained at an alarming rate, evaporating in a matter of weeks. What had been intended as stabilization became acceleration. Faced with the imminent loss of its remaining reserves, Britain was forced to suspend convertibility almost immediately. The policy reversal stemmed the outflow, but it could not repair the damage. Confidence in the pound was broken, and with it Britain's remaining claim to monetary leadership. From that point forward, the pound no longer anchored the international system. The dollar did. Britain had avoided starvation and default, but at the cost of surrendering the final instrument of financial independence. Dependency, once temporary, had become irreversible. The loss of monetary credibility had consequences that extended far beyond finance. With its reserves depleted and its currency weakened, Britain could no longer sustain the strategic commitments that had defined its status as a great power. In early 1947, the British government informed Washington that it was withdrawing from its long-standing role as guarantor of stability in Greece and Turkey. For decades, Britain had shouldered responsibility for containing regional instability and limiting external influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now it acknowledged that it could no longer afford to do so. The message was blunt. Britain was stepping back, and the burden would have to be assumed by the United States. This transfer marked more than a diplomatic adjustment. It signaled the formal handover of global leadership. The Truman Doctrine that followed was not a reaction to sudden danger, but a response to a vacuum Britain could no longer fill. Where London retreated, Washington advanced not as a replacement ally, but as the new center of power. From that point forward, Britain remained influential, but no longer decisive. It possessed history, institutions, and alliances, but lacked the financial and strategic autonomy required to shape events independently. The empire endured briefly in form, but its global function had ended. Britain had survived the war and avoided collapse, yet the price of survival was the surrender of its role as a superpower. What remained was not defeat, but diminution formalized, acknowledged, and irreversible. The end of Britain's global role did not conclude the transaction. It merely marked the beginning of its repayment. The Anglo-American loan agreed to in 1946 was not forgiven, renegotiated, or quietly absorbed as the cost of victory. It remained a commercial obligation, accruing interest year after year. While the war faded into memory and empires dissolved across the globe, the debt endured. Successive British governments of different parties and ideologies continued to service the loan through periods of reconstruction, prosperity, inflation, and reform. The payments became routine, detached from the circumstances that had created them. For 6 decades, interest flowed steadily from the British Treasury to Washington. The obligation survived devaluations of the pound, oil shocks, financial crises, and political realignments. It outlasted the generation that had fought the war and the one that rebuilt afterward. By the time the final installment was made in 2006, 3 generations of taxpayers had contributed to settling a bill incurred in the moment of national emergency. The longevity of the debt mattered not only for its cost, but for what it symbolized. It was a reminder that the war's financial settlement had never been reset. Britain had regained stability, but not autonomy. Victory had been achieved without forgiveness, and survival without closure. The last payment closed the account, but it did not erase the terms under which it had been opened. With the final payment made and the ledger closed, the broader pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The system that reshaped Britain did not rely on occupation, annexation, or overt conquest. It operated through instruments that appeared technical rather than coercive. Debt that outlasted emergencies, assistance bound by conditions that restructured economies, forced liquidation presented as fiscal responsibility, and security arrangements that exchanged autonomy for protection. Power was not seized by armies marching across borders, but accumulated through contracts, currencies, and commitments that endured long after crises had passed. This method proved both effective and repeatable. Variations of the same framework emerged in post-war Germany, in occupied Japan, and later in South Korea. Each case differed in circumstance and outcome, yet the underlying structure remained familiar. Reconstruction was financed, markets were opened, currencies were aligned, and military basing became permanent. Prosperity followed, but so did dependence. Growth occurred within boundaries defined elsewhere, reinforced by financial integration and security guarantees that limited strategic independence. In this interpretation, empire did not vanish in the 20th century. It adapted. It shed the visible markers of control and replaced them with systems that normalized imbalance while presenting stability as partnership. The result was a network of allies bound less by subjugation than by design. Britain was not unique in this process, but it was the prototype. What followed elsewhere was not imitation by coincidence, but replication by precedent. An empire built not by conquest, but by architecture. Taken together, these events lead to a conclusion that is both simple and unsettling. Britain won the war, yet it lost the empire that victory was meant to preserve. Survival was achieved, but at a price that extended far beyond the battlefield. The assistance that sustained Britain during its darkest hours did not restore its position afterward. It replaced it. What was presented as rescue functioned as acquisition, executed gradually, legally, and without spectacle. Britain was not conquered by force, nor betrayed in secret. It was purchased through necessity, its assets exchanged for time, its autonomy traded for survival. This framing does not deny the reality of alliance or the legitimacy of wartime cooperation. It reframes their outcome. The relationship that emerged was not one of equals, but of transition from one center of power to another. The language of friendship softened the mathematics of dependency, but it did not alter them. When the fighting ended, the ledger remained. The purpose of this narrative is not condemnation, but recognition. It asks the reader to look beyond heroic summaries and examine the mechanisms beneath them. Empires do not always fall in defeat. Sometimes they dissolve quietly, one agreement at a time, while the war is still being won. Britain survived Hitler. It did not survive the terms of peace. If this story challenged what you thought you knew about power, alliance, and history, share your perspective in the comments. Debate sharpens understanding. And if you found value in this analysis, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter.